My stepmother convinced my father to sell the house my mother left behind so that he could share the money with her children, but now they are begging me to leave all of this in the past. This is a temporary account because I don't want anything to affect me again. I never imagined that one day I would have to tell a story like this, which is why I don't want to use my main account. I am a 25-year-old woman, and I have always had a complicated relationship with my father, mainly because of how self-centered he is. That sums things up pretty well. But if you want more details, I can tell you that he always put his needs and desires above everything else, without caring about or even considering others. I never understood what my mother saw in him, but they got married and had me. I once asked her about it, and she told me that he hadn't always been that way, which was hard for me to believe. So we never had that close father-daughter bond. However, my relationship with my mother was entirely different. She was the true definition of a mother. She took me everywhere with her, and we did everything together. My parents came from completely different backgrounds. My father grew up in a dangerous neighborhood, and his parents were not the best role models, especially his father, who unfortunately passed away in prison years ago. I never met my paternal grandparents because, as my mother explained, they were toxic and untrustworthy people. My mother, on the other hand, came from a well-known family that was loved by everyone. My parents met in college, and my mother always described their first date as magical and romantic. Again, I found that hard to believe because I almost never saw my father being affectionate with her. As I grew up, I learned that my maternal grandparents never wanted my mother to marry my father, but they eventually accepted and supported her decision because she seemed happy. Unfortunately, my mother suffered multiple miscarriages and a stillbirth before having me, so I have no siblings. After my birth, she had her tubes tied because she didn't want to go through the pain of trying again. She was just grateful that she at least had me, but my birth was only the beginning of her health problems. Shortly after I was born, my mother was diagnosed with cancer. It was a dark time, but in the end, happiness returned to our family. My mother managed to beat cancer, life went on, and we were grateful for this second chance. Everything was going well. She was a hardworking woman who had her own business, despite coming from a well-off family. Don't get me wrong, my father was also hardworking, but he always gave in to unnecessary societal pressures. He felt the need to show off as if he had money, even when he didn't. I mean, he earned a decent income, but nothing worth boasting about. My mother was actually the one who brought in most of the money, but no one knew that except my maternal family. Everyone else thought it was my father who was making all the money. Unfortunately, tragedy struck and my mother's cancer returned. This time, it was far worse than before. She had to stop working, and eventually, she spent more time in the hospital than at home. At that time, I was in college, but luckily not too far from her, so I visited every weekend. I made that trip every Friday night and returned Monday morning, but every second with my mother was worth it. My father wasn't at the hospital much, but I assumed it was because he visited more during the week when I wasn't there. My mother passed away shortly after my 21st birthday, and it was the worst birthday gift I could have received. At least I can say that the funeral was beautiful because her parents took care of everything, despite being just as, if not more, devastated than I was over losing their daughter. Then came the will. Since my mother's death wasn't sudden, she had time to get everything in order. 6 months later, my father introduced me to my stepmother, Melissa, and her 2 children, Joey and Nadine. And it wasn't just an introduction to a new girlfriend. He planned to marry her. Not only that, but he justified it by saying that my mother would have wanted him not to be alone. Then I found out that Melissa worked at the same company as my father, so everything was as suspicious as you can imagine. What made things worse was that my relationship with my future step-siblings was not great. Joey and Nadine had no interest in having a sibling, so they wanted me to stay as far away from them as possible. Melissa wasn't any better. She told me to my face from the very beginning that she had no plans of being a mother to me, even though I was already an adult and didn't need another mother because she already had her own children to take care of. Either way, I wasn't living with them, so it wasn't like it affected me much. I wasn't planning on having a close relationship with them anyway. The most I would ever have to share with them were occasional dinners or holidays. Once my mother's estate was settled and we received our shares, my father immediately married Melissa and bought her a new house. Then he bought her a new car and has been covering all of Joey and Nadine's expenses ever since. They are also adults like me, but according to him, they haven't found their purpose yet, so they don't work or study. Since my father bought a house with only 3 bedrooms and Melissa made it very clear that the 2 extra rooms were for her kids, I wasn't allowed to visit for extended stays. Then there was the house I grew up in, which was in my mother's name and which she left to me. My father received 50% of what my mother left behind, and I got the other 50%. That brings us to the present. I am currently in medical school after completing my undergraduate degree in health sciences. I am so grateful that my mother left money to cover my tuition in case I didn't get a scholarship or financial aid. Med school isn't exactly cheap. One day while I was in class, I received a text from my father. I was surprised because we barely spoke and the last time I saw him was over a year ago. He asked if we could meet for lunch. Since I was in class, I decided not to respond and planned to read it later. But he was impatient and sent another message, this time a long paragraph. He said he didn't like how distant we had become and wanted to work on our relationship. After class, I agreed to meet him. We met over the weekend at one of my favorite restaurants, and I was surprised that he actually knew it was one of my favorite places to eat, since he had made a reservation. We talked about our lives, and then he asked about medical school. He said he couldn't wait to brag about his daughter becoming a doctor, which made me smile a little. Let me be clear, this was the first real conversation we had in a long time. But then he took things further. He started apologizing for everything. He admitted to making many mistakes after my mother's death and said he wanted to make things right. He told me that my stepmother and step-siblings also wanted to improve their relationship with me, which surprised me. I told him I would think about it. Then he asked if they could come over for dinner next weekend so we could talk about everything and put the past behind us. Well, I agreed. If that dinner was as pleasant as this lunch, I wouldn't lose anything. Unless, of course, they poisoned the food. But I wasn't expecting something that extreme. At worst, I figured I would just waste one evening of my life. After lunch with my father, I went to my cousin Derek's house. He is my Aunt Meredith's son and is like an older brother to me. When I told him about my plan to reconcile with my father and his new family, he was completely against it. Not only did he oppose it, but he made it very clear. To him, my father's intentions weren't genuine, and deep down, I also felt the same way. We talked about it for a while, and now I don't know. Do you think I should meet with my father or not? Like I said, at worst, I'll just waste one night. And since my father is the one providing the meal, I don't think I have much to lose. I didn't receive many comments before the dinner in my previous post, so I had to make a decision on my own. And that was to meet with my father and his family. So, going back to that night, my father and his new family arrived at my house for dinner. They brought food they had bought, so all I had to do was set it on the table. As I mentioned before, my stepmother had this terrible habit of being extremely indifferent and never being willing to listen to other people's opinions or perspectives, which always led to conflicts between us. However, I noticed a change in my step-siblings. Nadine, who had never been one to offer help to anyone, actually offered to help me set the table. She told me about her plans to start college next fall because she had finally figured out what she wanted to do. About time, I suppose. I was happy to hear that and told her that if she ever needed help, she shouldn't hesitate to ask me. During dinner, my father told me how proud he was of me and everything I had accomplished. Yes, my father was still being unusually attentive toward me, which only made me more suspicious. Then my stepmother asked when I would be graduating. I told her that I only had 3 months of school left and that after that, I would begin my residency. She then asked where I would be doing my residency and if I got accepted in another state, what would happen to the house. Since starting medical school, I had been living in the house my mother left me, as there was a university nearby and I was able to move back. I went silent for a moment and realized that I had never really considered that possibility before. However, Joey stepped in and told her to stop stressing me out, saying that I would deal with it after my exams. It felt nice to have him defend me, even just a little. Dinner went well, and we all agreed to work on improving our relationships. However, I found it very strange that my stepmother was so concerned about the house. Yes, it was suspicious. Later, the next day, I noticed that my father had posted about my upcoming graduation on Facebook, which gave me a weird feeling. I understand that he is proud of me, but why does he feel the need to broadcast it on social media? Yes, everything about them seems suspicious now. I would think that my father and stepmother want my house, but they already bought one with the money my mother left them. My father also inherited my mother's business because he knew I wouldn't be able to take care of it. That's why she left me more money than she left my father, so that we would each receive 50%. Maybe he's after that money, but I don't know. It's not like I'm going to write him a check. What do you all think? Well, now we know exactly what my father wanted and the reason behind his sudden change. At the very least, I'm glad I didn't let him come back into my life so easily. That dinner was just that, a dinner. And all we agreed on was to try to improve our relationship, which ultimately won't be happening. But let's get to what really matters. I was busy preparing notes for my group study session when someone knocked on my door. It was the sheriff from my town. He pulled out a document and told me I had been served. Served for what? He had me sign to acknowledge receipt of the notification and then left. I started reading the document, and that's when I realized what was happening. I was furious. My father had gone to court, and his lawyer had filed an eviction notice against me. He was giving me 30 days to pack my things and leave the house. He was also claiming that the house rightfully belonged to him because his name was on the property deed, which was a complete lie. Somehow, he had managed to forge a document stating that he was the owner of the house and not my mother. I decided to call him and put an end to this nonsense once and for all. And just like that, the old father I knew so well came back, the one who was cold and distant toward me. Gone was the man who just 2 weeks ago was begging for us to reconcile. He told me that I was occupying his house like an intruder and that it was time for me to find my own place instead of living off of him. I actually laughed at him because he hasn't done a single thing for me since my mom passed away. I told him I wasn't leaving my house. I made sure to emphasize my house so there was no confusion. He responded by saying that I had to leave his house, putting extra emphasis on the his. I could hear my stepmother in the background telling him that I needed to leave immediately, that he had to tell me because they needed to move their things in. Now it all made sense. That's why she was asking so many questions about the house. They wanted it. I still don't understand why though, because as far as I knew, they already had a house of their own. And I have to admit, it's nicer than this old house. I asked him why he wanted this house if he already had one. Was he going to give me his? He said no. He just wanted to move back into a house that held many memories for him, and that besides, this house was bigger and perfect for all of them. And in a way, he had a point. Despite being old, the house is also more spacious. I repeated again that it was my house, and I wasn't giving it to him. But I told him that if he had a market-high offer, I might consider it. If not, he could go ask his new kids to get him a bigger house. But then I remembered that they're lazy and have nothing, not even jobs or an education. That's when he started screaming at me, saying I had no right to insult his children and that I was just jealous of them. Right. Jealous of the fact that they are nearly the same age as me and have nothing to show for it. Sure, I inherited this house from my mother. I didn't earn it through my own work, but I got into medical school through my own effort, something his new kids will never achieve because they have done nothing with their lives. The conversation pretty much ended there. Now, according to the notice, I have 30 days to leave my house. Well, first thing Monday morning, I'll be talking to my lawyer. It has been exactly 1 week since I was served the eviction notice, so I'm still within the legal time frame. But don't worry, my father is not going to evict me from my own house. Thanks to my Aunt Meredith, I was able to get in touch with my mother's lawyer, Keith. My aunt even came with me to the meeting because she was just as furious with my father as I was, maybe even more. She was part of the family that hated the idea of my mother being with him in the first place. Keith reassured me that the house legally belonged only to my mother and that she had explicitly left it to me. He had documents to prove it, though he needed some time to locate them in the archives. But he told me not to worry. After the meeting, my aunt and I went for coffee, and she was even more furious than before. The caffeine was a bad idea. She looked like she could smash the table in half with her head. She started ranting about my father, and then, accidentally, she let something slip. My father had been having an affair with Melissa before my mother passed away. I immediately asked her to repeat what she had just said. Realizing what she had just revealed, my aunt sighed and confessed. She told me she had always known that my father was cheating on my mother with Melissa. She revealed that the affair had started as soon as my mother's cancer returned. She had wanted to tell my mother, but it wasn't exactly the kind of news you deliver to someone going through cancer treatment again, especially when the chances of survival were slim. She also never told me after my mother's death because she knew how devastated I was and didn't want to add more pain. Besides, I had already chosen to distance myself from my father. It's not like I hadn't considered the possibility before, but I never thought my father would actually do something like that. The most I had suspected was that they had feelings for each other and just waited until my mother died to act on them. Not that it would have made things better, but at least he wouldn't have been unfaithful to her. But now with proof, it was an entirely different story. Everyone had found it suspicious how quickly my father married Melissa after my mother passed, but no one dared to say anything out loud out of respect for her. Now, I knew I had to expose my father and get revenge for everything he had put me through. While waiting for Keith to send me the official documents, I started planning how to get back at him. The first thing I did was look up whether the house my father had bought was listed for sale. In a town this small, there weren't many listings to check, and sure enough, there it was. I told my aunt about this, and she said she could dig for more information. 2 days later, she came back with everything. My father was trying to sell the house because he had lost my mother's business and had taken out a mortgage that he now couldn't afford to pay. Now it all made sense. That's why they desperately needed a house, so much so that they were willing to forge legal documents to take mine. I know, I've been silent ever since this whole drama exploded, but I promise I have something that will more than make up for the lack of updates. So, my father called for a meeting with our lawyers instead of taking me to court. I lied and told him that I would move out before the 30-day deadline and promised not to take him to trial, that we could settle this with our lawyers instead. Of course, he agreed. He knew he had no chance of winning. The day of the meeting arrived, and my father immediately looked nervous when he saw Keith. My stepmother, on the other hand, had this arrogant smile, probably because she had no idea who Keith was or how badly he was about to ruin their lives. Yes, he's that kind of Keith. As soon as we sat down, my stepmother demanded that I hand over all the house keys and sign a document stating that I would never claim the house in the future, just in case I changed my mind and decided to sue them. But then, Keith pulled out his own set of documents, and just like that, it was over. He easily proved that the house wasn't theirs. He explained that, sure, they could file a false police report with their forged documents, but those wouldn't hold up in a property dispute trial. However, they would hold up in a fraud case. Keith also pointed out that, while he wasn't a specialist in fraud cases, he knew someone who was. And while that person's name wasn't Keith, they could also ruin their lives. That's when their attitude immediately switched to love and peace mode. Suddenly, they were begging me to let it all go, promising they would do anything to move past this. I shook my head and told my father that I was going to expose everything he had done to me. Out of pure panic, my father confessed, right then and there, that my stepmother had forced him to do everything. He said that Melissa had threatened to expose their affair while my mother was still alive, and that he didn't want to do that to her, that she had practically forced him to marry her, because otherwise, she would tell everyone that he had been unfaithful. My stepmother's face darkened. Then, my father went on to blame her for their massive debts, claiming that she was the reason they needed a new house so desperately. And then, he admitted it. The only reason he had contacted me was to find out more about the house and see if they could manipulate me into giving it to them, so they could sell it and pay off their debts, all while keeping their own house. At that moment, Melissa and my father started arguing in front of everyone, completely forgetting we were even there. At one point, Melissa blurted out that her real plan was to sell the house, split the money with her kids, and leave my father to deal with the debts alone. When they finally shut up, Keith stepped in again and dropped the bomb. He reminded them that my mother's will included an infidelity clause. If infidelity could be proven, then all the money my father was supposed to receive would legally pass to me instead. I guess my mother suspected something all along. I can't help but think that she knew and chose not to say anything, just so it wouldn't ruin the last moments we had together. Keith also pointed out that there were witnesses to everything they had just said in that room, and that hiring a private investigator wouldn't be difficult. Melissa didn't care. After all, the money was already gone, and it hadn't been hers in the first place. But then, I reminded her of something. Now that she was married to my father, she was about to become a lot poorer. And if she divorced him, she would get nothing, because she'd be divorcing a bankrupt man. Maybe I shouldn't have said it, but I also reminded her that her kids wouldn't help her either, because they depended entirely on my father, which meant that they too were about to be ruined. No jobs, no money, and no shame about being freeloaders. That set her off. She got so angry that she stood up, ready to attack me. But as she was about to throw a punch, or at least that's what it looked like because she didn't exactly seem very coordinated, my father blocked her before she could hit me, though he did take the hit himself. Not sure if it was intentional on her part or just an accident, but she definitely hit him. And that's when my father snapped. He yelled that he was done with her and that he wanted nothing more to do with her. Melissa lost her mind. She threatened to expose all of my father's dirty secrets. It was a productive meeting. No one brought food, no snacks, but we did leave with enough information to take them to court. And while the legal battle will take time, I've already started taking action. With my real lawyer, who isn't named Keith, guiding me, I have already posted a long expose on social media, detailing everything my father did. It might not change much legally, but at the very least, it will show the world exactly what kind of people he and his wife really are. I don't think this update will be very long, but there are a few things I want to put down. Melissa has already filed for divorce from my father. My aunt and I believe that she has simply accepted the losses and wants to cut ties with my father as soon as possible, maybe before she gets too old to find another gullible fool like him. My step-siblings have tried to reach out to me. They said they had always wanted to have a sibling relationship with me, but just didn't know how. Funny how they only realized this when they needed my house. I told them that I sincerely hope their mother finds someone rich because with their level of intelligence, they're going to struggle a lot in life. Not sure if they understood the comment, but I didn't wait to find out. I just blocked them. Yes, my father has also been trying to contact me, but my only response has been that he should do so through the lawyers. It can be Keith or the other one, I don't care. I'm not interested in whether he suddenly wants to become a father to his daughter now. The lawsuit for the money he took will remain in place until he returns every last cent. That's what my mother fought for in her will, and I want to honor her memory. It doesn't matter if my father has money to pay or not. I think another update might come soon because my father doesn't have much money left to pay for lawyers. He has a new job now after quitting the one he had and taking over my mother's business. It's not the same place where he met Melissa, that's all I know. Melissa at least still has her job. I love bringing good news, especially when it's good news for me. My father has officially agreed to repay the money, signing a contract that will deduct 25% of his salary until he pays off the debt, including interest. Now I can finally say this. Keith had already told me that proving infidelity after so much time would be very difficult. Taking it to court would have been a bad move since the affair wasn't something currently happening. I didn't mention this before, just in case my father was reading these updates. But now that he's legally bound to pay me back, there's no escape for him. It will take a long time for my father to repay everything, but it's not like I need the money immediately. He has also finalized his divorce with Melissa, and she walked away with absolutely nothing. The house they bought was sold, but only to cover part of their debts. Yes, my father will remain in debt for a long time. And here's the best part. Not all of the debts were his, as Melissa had thought. Some of them were also hers, including part of the mortgage and credit card bills that were in her name. So the only thing those two ended up splitting in the divorce was debt. Oh, and another small detail. Melissa doesn't have a job anymore. Thanks to my post, her company launched an investigation. Turns out the company where my father worked had a strict policy against workplace relationships because, well, they never end well. I mean, you don't have to tell me that. My father had resigned before their relationship became official. Big air quotes. Did someone come forward and say they had seen them together before? I have no idea, but that's the information I got. And honestly, I almost feel bad for Melissa. Now she's jobless, in debt, and has 2 adult babies to take care of. Must be tough.